He stood at his father's grave with dirt still on his boots and a lawyer's letter already in his hand. The ultimatum was simple: marry within 1 year or lose everything. Gideon Mercer had survived drought, debt, and the kind of heartbreak that turns a man to stone. He had sworn, on every scar his past left behind, that he would never trust a woman again. But desperation doesn't negotiate. Neither does a will written by a dead man with the last laugh. This is the story of a marriage no one believed in, and the miracle no one saw coming. Drop your city in the comments right now and hit that like button. Let's see how far this story travels. The reading of Hector Mercer's will took place on a Tuesday, which Gideon always thought was the cruelest day of the week. Not dramatic enough to be a Monday, not far enough along to carry any promise. Just a gray, unremarkable Tuesday in the tail end of October, when the fields around Harlan County were brown and the sky looked like it couldn't decide whether to rain or just threaten to. Gideon sat in the leather chair across from Aldous Peak, the family attorney, and tried to keep his expression neutral. He was good at neutral. He'd spent the better part of his adult life perfecting it. The flat jaw, the still eyes, the posture that said, "Whatever you're about to tell me, I've already survived worse." He wasn't sure that was true today. Aldous cleared his throat. He was a small man, neat and precise, the kind of man who ironed his handkerchiefs and kept his pencils sharpened to the same length. He had handled Mercer family business for 20 years. He had seen Hector Mercer in every mood imaginable: generous, paranoid, cruel, sentimental. And he had learned long ago to deliver bad news the way you set down a lamp in a room full of gunpowder. Carefully, without any sudden movements. "Before I begin," Aldous said, setting the papers flat on the desk with both palms, "I want you to understand that I advised your father against this provision. Several times, in writing." Gideon's jaw tightened a fraction. Just a fraction. "Just read it." Aldous read it. The language was dense with legal scaffolding, but the meaning cut through clean as a blade. Hector Mercer, in his infinite stubbornness, a stubbornness that had apparently survived death itself, had attached a condition to the inheritance of Mercer Ranch. His son, Gideon Harlan Mercer, must be legally married within 12 months of the date of Hector's death. If that condition wasn't met, the entirety of the Mercer estate, 6,000 acres, the main house, the cattle operation, the water rights, the equipment, the mineral leases, would transfer to the estate's secondary beneficiary. And the secondary beneficiary, Gideon said slowly, is who, exactly? Aldous pressed his lips together. "Your cousin, Randall Mercer." The name landed in the room like something thrown. Gideon was quiet for a very long moment. Outside the window, a crow landed on the fence post and looked in, then left. "Sensible bird. Randall Mercer," Gideon repeated, "who lives in Phoenix, who has never set foot on that land more than twice in his life, who works in—" He paused, as if the word itself required physical effort, "real estate development." "That is correct?" "He'd sell it." "I suspect he would, yes. He'd sell 6 generations of my family's land to put up what? A subdivision? A shopping complex?" Aldous said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Gideon stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room. His hands were in fists at his sides, though he wasn't aware of it. He was staring at the street below. A quiet main street in a quiet small town. The kind of place where everybody knew your name and the majority of what they thought they knew about you was wrong. He thought about his father, about what it meant that the old man had done this. Whether it was one last attempt at control from beyond the grave or something stranger, something that almost resembled concern. Hector Mercer had never been a man who expressed worry in any language that resembled warmth. He expressed it the way he expressed everything else, as an order. "Get married, boy, or lose what I spent my life building." "I need some air," Gideon said, and he walked out before Aldous could respond. The town of Millhaven, Texas had approximately 2,300 people, a grain elevator, 4 churches, a diner that served the same menu it had used since 1987, and more opinions per square mile than anywhere Gideon had ever been. By Thursday, 2 days after the will was read, those opinions were already in full circulation. He heard them at the feed store. He heard them at the gas pump. He caught the tail end of a conversation through the open window of the barber shop that he pretended he hadn't heard, but did. The general consensus seemed to be a mixture of amusement and anticipation, the way people feel about a slow-motion wreck they know is coming but can't look away from. Gideon Mercer, married? Who'd have him? You see the condition in the will? Old Hector was crazier than we thought. He's going to lose the ranch, mark my words. Man like that doesn't bend. He bought his feed, filled his truck, and drove home. Let them talk. People in Millhaven had been talking about him since he was 19 years old, and Vivian Hart publicly chose another man at the Founders' Day dance in front of half the county. He'd survived that. He'd survived this. But survive wasn't the same as solve, and he knew it. He sat at the kitchen table that night with a cup of coffee that went cold while he stared at the grain of the wood, and he thought hard about what he was actually willing to do. The ranch was everything. Not in a sentimental, poetic way, though there was some of that too, buried under years of callous and pragmatism. It was everything in the most literal sense. His income, his purpose, the physical ground he'd walked since before he could read, his father's 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 ground. 6 generations of Mercers had pulled something living from that land, and the thought of Randall coming in with his polo shirt and his developer contacts and his complete indifference to what any of it meant. No, not while Gideon was breathing, which meant he needed a wife. The thought sat in his chest like a stone. He was 38 years old, and he had not been in a serious relationship since Vivian, which was a significant portion of his adult life spent in deliberate, armor-plated solitude. It wasn't that women hadn't been interested. A few had tried over the years. He'd kept everything surface level, arm's length, brief. He was not mean about it. He was simply impenetrable, and eventually they moved on to someone more available. He didn't want love. He'd had that, or something he'd called that, and it had humiliated him completely. What he wanted now was simpler, a transaction, an arrangement, something 2 adults with aligned practical interests could enter into without anyone getting hurt. He poured the cold coffee down the sink and went to bed and lay there in the dark thinking about which women in Harlan County might possibly agree to that kind of proposition. Most wouldn't. Most would want flowers, romance, emotional availability, things he wasn't capable of providing and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. He'd be honest about that up front. He owed whoever he approached that much. He fell asleep eventually, but it wasn't a restful sleep. He thought of Eleanor Finch 3 days later, and the thought arrived the way practical thoughts often do, not dramatically, but with a kind of quiet logic that made him feel he should have gotten there sooner. Eleanor Finch was 37. She lived in the small house at the edge of Millhaven's east side, a white clapboard house that her mother had owned, and that Eleanor had lived in for the past 18 years while caring for that mother through a long, grinding illness that had finally ended 8 months ago. Since then, Eleanor had been working part-time at Peake's law office, which was where Gideon had first really noticed her. Noticed being relative, since he'd probably seen her 100 times over the years without registering her as a specific person. Millhaven had a way of making certain people invisible. Eleanor was one of them. She was not beautiful in the way the town rewarded, not the kind of woman who turned heads at the diner or got asked to dance at the Founders' Day celebration. She was plain-featured, quiet-voiced, and had spent so many years in her mother's sick room that she'd somehow faded into the background of the town's social fabric. People were kind enough to her mostly, the way they're kind to furniture. Present. Unremarkable. Unimportant. The town's most charitable assessment of her was sensible. The less charitable ones, and there were those, called her an old maid. To her face sometimes. Small towns could be ruthless in the particular cruelty of diminishment. What Gideon knew, because he paid attention to things other people didn't, was this. Eleanor Finch was sharp. He'd watched her at Peake's office on 2 separate occasions when he'd come in for ranch business. She'd caught an arithmetic error in a lease contract that Aldous himself had missed. She'd filed documents with a precision and organization that had apparently cut Aldous' retrieval time in half. She read constantly. Serious books, accounting texts, agricultural journals. Not the kind of reading people did to pass time, but the kind they did to actually learn something. She was in debt. Her mother's medical costs had been significant, and the house was mortgaged twice over. But she was managing it with the careful discipline of someone who understood that the only way through a financial hole was arithmetic and patience. She was, in short, a woman with no good options and a great deal of quiet capability. He didn't let himself think too hard about whether that made her a perfect solution or a person he was about to exploit. He told himself it was both, and that he'd be honest about it, and that honesty was at least something. He went to the law office on a Wednesday morning and asked Aldous if he could have a private word with Miss Finch. Aldous looked at him over his glasses for a long, speculative moment, then stood up and announced he was going to get coffee and would be back in 20 minutes. Eleanor looked up from her desk. She was wearing a green cardigan with one small stain near the cuff, ink or coffee, hard to tell, and her brown hair was pulled back practically. She had a ledger open in front of her and a pencil in her hand, and she looked at him with the direct, slightly cautious expression of someone who has learned that when people approach them with purpose, it is usually because they need something. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "is there something I can help you with?" Gideon sat down across from her. He had decided the previous night that there was no good version of this conversation that involved building up to the point slowly. He was going to say what he was proposing, explain the terms, and let her decide. He said, "I expect you've heard about my father's will." "I work in a law office," she said, neither confirming nor denying. "I hear a great deal of things." "Then you know the condition." "I know there's a condition. I didn't make it my business to know the details." He believed her. That was actually one of the things that made him think she was worth talking to. She was not someone who trafficked in other people's business for sport. He'd noticed that. Most people in Millhaven did. Eleanor Finch kept what she knew to herself. He told her the details, all of them, the 12-month timeline, the marriage requirement, what happened if it wasn't met. He told her about Randall. He didn't editorialize about Randall, just stated the facts, but facts like that didn't need decoration. Eleanor listened without interrupting. She set down her pencil. When he finished, she said, "And you're here because you want me to marry you." "I'm here to ask if you'd consider it," he said. There's a difference. Something in her expression shifted slightly. He couldn't read it exactly. It wasn't surprise, or not only surprise. It might have been that she was recalibrating something, the way people do when a situation turns out to be different from the one they'd prepared for. "What would that look like?" she said. "Practically." He appreciated the question. He told her. She would live at the ranch. She would have her own room. He was very clear about that, very deliberate, because he wanted her to understand that this was not an arrangement he intended to complicate with anything resembling intimacy. She would have a salary. He named a figure that was fair, more than fair given what she'd been making at the law office. Her debts would be settled within 30 days of the wedding. The house, her mother's house, he would buy it outright and she could keep it in her name, a security she could return to if things went badly. He told her he would not make demands on her time outside of the practical requirements of the arrangement, appearing as his wife at whatever social events the ranch's business made necessary, managing whatever aspect of the household she found tolerable. He told her he was not easy to live with. He didn't say it as an apology, just as information. He was solitary and stubborn and not interested in being reformed, and she deserved to know that. "Why me?" she said, not defensively. As a genuine question, he thought about how to answer that. He decided on honesty, which he was better at than sentiment. "Because you're smart," he said. "Because you need a solution, and so do I. And that's a better foundation for this kind of arrangement than anything based on feeling. Because you're not going to make this into something it isn't." A pause. "And because," he added, "I believe you'd keep the terms." She looked at him for a long time. It was an unsettling kind of look. Not hostile, just thorough. The way she might look at a ledger page, she wasn't sure she trusted yet. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course." 3 days. "All right." He stood, put on his hat, and left. She came to him in 2 days, not 3. She drove out to the ranch on a Friday afternoon in her old blue sedan that had a dent in the passenger door and a crack along the bottom of the windshield. She parked in the drive and got out and walked toward him, where he was standing by the fence, and she walked the way she always did. Not tentatively, not with any performance of confidence either, just steadily, like a woman who has already made up her mind and is simply covering the distance between here and the conversation. "I have conditions," she said. He had expected that. "Tell me." "I want it in writing, all of it. The salary, the house, the debt settlement, everything you said. I want it as a legal contract separate from the marriage itself, and I want Aldous Peak to witness it." "Done." She paused for just a moment. I want to be treated with basic respect. I understand this is a business arrangement. I'm not asking for anything sentimental, but I'm not a servant and I'm not invisible, and I need to know you understand that. He looked at her. The afternoon sun was at an angle that caught the side of her face, and he noticed for the first time that she had a small scar at her jaw. Old, faded, the kind left by some childhood accident. He didn't know why he noticed it. He said, I understand. And if at any point this arrangement becomes, she searched for the right word, unbearable for either of us, we talk about it like adults. Agreed. She nodded once. Then she extended her hand and he shook it, and that was the strange, unromantic beginning of a marriage that the entire town of Millhaven had already decided was doomed. The wedding took place 18 days later in Aldous Peake's office. No flowers, no guests except Aldous and his secretary Marta, who served as witnesses. A justice of the peace named Harold Kimball, who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and seemed to be thinking about lunch. Gideon wore his best shirt, which was clean, but had a small tear at the collar he hadn't noticed until they were already in the office. And then it was too late to do anything about it, so he didn't. Eleanor wore a navy blue dress that he later learned she'd bought at the consignment shop on Orchard Street for $14, which told him something about her priorities that he found, against his expectations, quietly admirable. Harold Kimball got through the ceremony in 8 minutes. When he pronounced them husband and wife and suggested that the groom might kiss the bride, Gideon and Eleanor looked at each other with the shared understanding of two people standing in the same awkward situation, and Eleanor solved it by leaning forward and pressing her lips to his cheek, brief and businesslike, and then stepping back. Marta made a sound that might have been a suppressed sniffle. Aldous shook both their hands. They drove back to the ranch in separate vehicles. The house sat at the center of 600 acres of working ranch land, surrounded by mesquite and cedar and a lot of sky. It was a big house, 4 bedrooms, wide porch, solid construction from the 1920s that had been added onto impractically by 3 different generations of Mercers, which meant the hallways didn't quite align, and one of the bathrooms was accessible only through a bedroom. It had the accumulated clutter of a house where a man had lived alone for years, stacks of livestock journals, boots near every door, dishes clean but stacked wrong. A kitchen that had clearly not been used for anything more ambitious than eggs and canned soup in a very long time. Eleanor stood in the kitchen doorway on her first evening and looked at it. Gideon stood behind her, aware of how it must look to someone whose own house, even diminished by poverty, had probably been kept with more care. I'll get someone in to clean, he said. If you want. I'd rather do it myself, she said. I need to know where things are. He didn't argue. She spent the first week learning the house, not just cleaning it, mapping it, the way you'd map territory you intended to occupy seriously. She found where the drafts came in. She found which drawer stuck in the humidity. She found the box of his mother's china that had been sitting unopened in a hall closet for what looked like 15 years. She didn't move the china. She noted it and left it alone. She did not try to change anything about how he operated. She cooked supper and put it on the table at 6 o'clock and did not wait for him if he wasn't there. She was in the kitchen when he came in, and she'd nod, and they'd eat in a silence that was, to his surprise, not particularly uncomfortable. She asked practical questions about the water pressure, about which lock on the back door needed a new key, about whether the small room off the kitchen could be converted to an office. What do you need an office for? He said. I'd like to look at the ranch accounts, she said. He stopped with his fork halfway to his mouth. Why? She looked at him the way she'd looked at him in Aldous' office, direct, assessing, no particular heat in it. Because, she said, I've noticed 3 different vendor invoices on the kitchen counter this week, and 2 of them don't look right to me. He didn't give her access to the accounts that night. He needed to think about it, which he did while riding fence line the next morning. 4 miles of it, slow, just him and the horse, and the cold November air, and the problem of Eleanor Finch sitting in his house with her sharp eyes and her unsettling habit of noticing things. He'd married her for practicality. He'd told himself she was intelligent, and he'd meant it. But there's a difference between theoretical intelligence and handing someone the financial interior of your operation and trusting them not to use it against you. He didn't trust people. That was a fact he had made peace with. But he was also not, when pushed to it, a fool. He rode back in at 11, put up the horse, and went into the kitchen. Eleanor was at the table with a cup of coffee and one of the livestock journals, reading it the way she read everything, with her full attention, a pencil in her hand making small marks in the margins. He dropped a ledger on the table in front of her. "That's the operating account," he said. "Last 18 months. She looked at it, then she looked at him. "The other two are in the office," he said. "The room by the back porch. I'll show you where the files are." She didn't say thank you. She said, "All right," and picked up the ledger, and that was it. The town noticed immediately that the marriage had happened, and their reaction was exactly what Gideon had expected, a kind of polite, thinly veiled skepticism wrapped in the social language of congratulations. At the feed store the first Saturday after the wedding, Dale Humphrey shook Gideon's hand and said, "Well, I'll be. Never thought I'd see the day," in a tone that was somehow both congratulatory and eulogistic. At the diner, Patsy Mullen, who ran the place, and also effectively ran Millhaven's rumor network with an efficiency that put most newspapers to shame, came out from behind the counter to present Gideon with what she called a little something, which turned out to be a casserole dish she'd clearly been keeping warm in the oven, and then spent 5 minutes asking questions that were technically about Eleanor but were really about whether the marriage was real or some kind of legal maneuver. Gideon answered with single syllables until Patsy ran out of questions. "She's a decent woman," Patsy said finally, landing on a diplomatic conclusion. "I'll say that. Not who I'd have expected, but, well, strange times." Gideon picked up his casserole and left. Eleanor, for her part, went into town on her own schedule and interacted with its residents with the same even quality she brought to everything. She was neither defensive about the marriage nor performed any visible happiness about it. She was simply herself, which seemed to unsettle people more than either of those alternatives. The postmaster's wife, Linda Greer, made the mistake of asking Eleanor, so in the middle of the post office, in front of 4 other people, whether it was strange, going from the life you had to living out there with him. The him had a particular weight to it, the kind that implied she knew things about Gideon that Eleanor probably didn't. Eleanor said in a voice that was perfectly pleasant, "I imagine most transitions are strange at first, Linda. How are your kids?" Linda blinked, then told her about the kids. Eleanor walked out with her mail and did not give Linda Greer another thought. Gideon heard about this exchange from 3 separate people. Each time, he listened without expression, nodded, and moved on. But he filed it. November moved into December, and the ranch's rhythms slowly, partially, incorporated Eleanor without entirely absorbing her. They were polite to each other, consistently polite, in a way that required some effort, not because they disliked each other, but because they were each managing a careful distance, the way 2 people might navigate a shared space without fully admitting they were sharing it. He woke at 4:30 every morning and was gone before she came downstairs. She had coffee ready when he came in at noon, not waiting on him, just it was there. He told himself he didn't notice these things. He noticed them. She worked in the office every evening for 2, sometimes 3 hours. He could see the light under the door when he passed the hallway on his way to bed. One night, he stopped at the door and knocked. "Come in," she said. The room had changed. She'd cleared out the accumulated junk, old catalogs, broken equipment parts someone had meant to fix, and organized what remained with that precise Eleanor logic that was becoming familiar to him. The desk faced the window, ledgers stacked in order by year. A list, handwritten, on a notepad beside the lamp. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "I'm almost finished with the March through May accounts," she said. "I wanted to finish before I stopped." She looked up. "You should see this before I write it up properly." "Write what up?" "Sit down," she said. He sat. She walked him through it, not quickly, deliberately, point by point, with the ledger open between them and her pencil moving. Her voice had a different quality in here than it did across a dinner table. Less careful, more precise, alive in a specific way. "Your feed supplier," she said. "Brannock's. You've been paying this invoice." She turned to a page, pointed, "Every month for a year and a half. You see this charge? Line item 14? He looked. "Freight handling." "It's not real," she said. "Or rather, it exists, but it's a flat fee for a service that your contract with Brannock specifies is included in the base rate." You've been double charged for freight handling every month for 18 months. He looked at the number. Then he looked at her. That's over $11,000, she said. Yes. A silence. And that's not the only one, she said. She turned pages. She showed him a pattern in the cattle buyer's settlement statements, a consistent rounding that always went the wrong direction. She showed him a service contract with a veterinary supply company that had an automatic renewal clause no one had canceled for services that hadn't been used in 2 years. She showed him 3 separate places where money had been leaving the ranch's accounts in ways that were individually small enough to miss, but collectively significant. How long did this take you? He said. 3 weeks, she said. Evenings. He sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at her. How did you know where to look? She considered the question. When something doesn't add up, she said, I can usually feel it before I can prove it. It's a kind of imbalance, like a shelf that's slightly off level. You don't always see it immediately, but you feel it. He thought about that. I want to write all of this up formally, she said. Document every instance, present it to the suppliers, and ask for an accounting. Some of this may be sloppiness rather than intentional fraud, but we need to know which. He looked at her across the lamplight. She had ink on her fingers, her left index finger and the side of her palm. There was a tenseness around her eyes that he recognized as the particular fatigue of sustained concentration, not tiredness from lack of sleep, but from spending hours thinking hard. All right, he said, write it up. And Gideon. She almost never used his first name. The sound of it in the lamplit room was slightly odd, like a key that fit a lock you'd forgotten you owned. This amount, this is what I found in 18 months of records. I haven't gone back further yet. He understood what she was saying. How far back do you want to go? He asked. As far as the records go, she said. He stood up. I'll get you the files from the storage room. Christmas arrived without fanfare. Gideon did not decorate. He had not decorated in years. It had seemed, in the years of living alone, like an eccentric and slightly depressing activity for one person. Eleanor produced a small pine wreath for the front door, which she hung without comment, and a set of candles for the kitchen windowsill. That was it. He found he didn't mind it. On Christmas Eve, she made a real supper. Not the simple, efficient meals that had become their ordinary routine, but an actual production. Roast with vegetables, bread she'd made herself, a pie that took most of the afternoon. He came in from the barn to find the kitchen smelling like something from a memory he'd thought he'd lost, and stood in the doorway for a moment before he moved. You didn't have to do this, he said. I know, she said, but it's Christmas. They sat down to eat. Somewhere in the second hour, with the candles low and the kitchen warm and the pie between them mostly reduced, the conversation wandered beyond the practical. She asked him, carefully, with the kind of care she brought to questions she wasn't sure she had the right to ask, about his father, not about the will, about the man. He answered without meaning to, or without deciding to, which was unusual for him. He told her about Hector Mercer, who had been a hard man to love and harder to understand. A man who had worked this land with the intensity of someone who believed that rest was a form of failure, who had held his son to a standard that moved every time Gideon got close to it, who had never once said the word proud in reference to anything Gideon did, but who had, the last time they'd spoken before his health declined, held his son's hand for a moment without explanation. Just held it. Eleanor listened. I think he didn't know how to say things, she said when Gideon stopped. No. A lot of people like that end up saying them sideways, she said. Indirectly, through... She paused. Through conditions in wills. Gideon looked at her. She wasn't being unkind about it. She was being honest, which was different. Maybe, he said. She poured more coffee. He didn't leave the table. They talked until nearly 11 o'clock, which was, he realized afterward, the longest conversation he'd had with another person in several years. He didn't examine that too closely. Some things were better not examined. January came in hard. A cold front pushed down from the panhandle with its teeth out, and the ranch's heating system, old and stubborn, like most things on the property, chose that week to partially surrender. 2 of the 3 zones went out. The repair parts took 4 days to arrive. Eleanor moved her things to the downstairs bedroom. the one that shared a wall with the fireplace. And Gideon kept the main bedroom, where a single electric space heater was barely adequate. By the second night, he'd relocated himself to the couch in the living room, near the fireplace. She came out at some point past midnight to get water and found him there. "The couch is bad for your back," she said. "The couch is fine." She looked at the couch, at him. "It's 15 years old and the middle cushion is completely compressed." "Eleanor, I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying." A pause. The fire cracked. "There's another option," she said, with the same practical tone she used for everything. "The bed in my room is a full. We're both adults. I'm not suggesting anything other than, I heard what you're suggesting." He looked at her. She looked back. Her hair was down. He'd never seen it down before. It was longer than he'd expected, dark and a little wavy, and she was wearing an old flannel robe that had probably been her mother's and holding a glass of water with both hands. "No," he said, not harshly, just clearly. She nodded once. "All right." She went back to her room. He lay back on the bad couch and stared at the ceiling, and did not sleep for a long time, and did not examine why. "I'll follow it." By the time February arrived, the ranch had recovered $11,000 in overcharges from Brannix, a tense negotiation that Eleanor had handled almost entirely by herself, with Gideon present but largely silent, because it became clear almost immediately that she was better at it than he was. Brannick, who was a large man with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with ranchers who didn't read their invoices carefully, had come to the meeting expecting to bluff his way through it. He sat across from Eleanor Mercer for 45 minutes and left having agreed to a full refund, a revised contract, and a corrected billing structure. After he left, Gideon stood in the ranch office and said, "Where did you learn to do that?" Eleanor looked up from the document she was already reviewing. 18 years of negotiating with insurance companies and hospital billing departments, she said. Sick people get taken advantage of. I learned early that the only way to stop it was to know the paperwork better than they did. He stood there a moment, looking at her. "Your mother was lucky," he said. She didn't look up, but her hand, for just a moment, stopped moving across the page. "She was," she said quietly. He left her to the paperwork. March brought the spring cattle sale, which was the ranch's largest annual revenue event. Eleanor had spent 6 weeks reviewing the previous 3 years of sale records and had identified 2 buyers who were systematically underbidding by coordinating in advance, a quiet, unspoken collusion that had cost the ranch a significant amount over time. She brought in 2 new buyers from a neighboring county, negotiated directly with a regional meat processing cooperative, and restructured the bidding process. The March sale came in 42% higher than the previous year. Gideon stood at the fence after the last truck pulled out, doing the math in his head, and the number kept coming out the same. He went to find Eleanor, who was in the office entering figures into the ledger. 42%, he said. 43, once the cooperative payment clears, she said, without looking up. Then, "Close the door, please. There's a draft." He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he closed the door and sat in the chair across from her desk, a chair that had, he realized, gradually become his chair in her office, a fact he hadn't consciously noticed until now. "Eleanor," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. The way he meant very few things, he said, which meant something, and he thought she probably understood that, though she gave no sign of it. "It's my job," she said. "It's more than your job," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, then she looked back at the ledger. "Let me finish this column," she said, "and then maybe we can have supper." He stayed in the chair while she worked. The lamplight was the same as it had been in November, when she'd first shown him the numbers. The room was different, though. Or maybe he was different. The cold office in November had felt like a business meeting. This felt like something he didn't have a good word for. He picked up a livestock journal from the corner of the desk and read it while she finished the column, and neither of them said anything, and it was somehow entirely comfortable. He did not examine that either. But he couldn't stop noticing it. The story of the 43% didn't stay inside the ranch's fence line. It never did. In Millhaven. Good news traveled almost as fast as bad news, though it gathered different kinds of attention. Within 2 weeks of the spring cattle sale, The numbers had worked their way through the feed store, the diner, the barber shop, and at least 3 church parking lots. And by the time the story completed its circuit, the figure had grown slightly in the telling, the way numbers always do when passed through enough hands. Some people were saying 50%. One man at the grain elevator claimed he'd heard it was double. The precise figure didn't matter as much as the shape of the thing. Mercer Ranch had just had its best spring sale in recent memory, and people wanted to understand why. The simplest explanation, that Eleanor Mercer had restructured the bidding process and brought in new buyers, was also, for a certain segment of Millhaven's population, the most difficult to accept. Not because they disliked Eleanor, particularly, but because accepting it required revising a comfortable story they'd been telling about her for years. The story of Eleanor Finch, sensible but unremarkable. The dutiful daughter who'd disappeared into her mother's illness and emerged, blinking and playing, into a world that had moved on without her. The woman who married Gideon Mercer out of desperation and would probably be back in that small East Side house before the year was out. That story was easier. This new one required more work. Patsy Mullen at the diner was the first to attempt the revision publicly, which was fitting since she'd been among the more vocal proponents of the original version. She told a table of women on a Thursday morning that Eleanor had always had a good head on her shoulders, you could tell, if you paid attention. The women at the table nodded, most of them having said no such thing, and several of them having said the opposite. But that was the particular social amnesia that Millhaven specialized in. People forgot what they'd said when the evidence contradicted it. They revised quietly and moved forward. Eleanor, for her part, heard none of this directly. She was too busy. April arrived, and with it a set of problems that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with the physical reality of running 6,000 acres of working ranch land. A section of the eastern fence line had deteriorated past repair and needed complete replacement. A significant cost, but one Eleanor had already anticipated and budgeted for in the operational plan she'd drafted over the winter and quietly left on Gideon's desk one morning without saying anything about it. He'd found it, read all 14 pages of it, and come to find her in the office. "You projected the fence replacement," he said, holding the document. "I projected several things," she said. "The fence is on page 6. How did you know it needed replacing? You haven't been out there." "No," she said. "But I read 3 years of maintenance logs and found a pattern. Every spring, there are minor repairs to that section. When minor repairs become annual, it usually means the structure itself is failing." She paused. "It would have become an emergency within 2 seasons. Emergency repairs cost more than planned ones." He looked at the document in his hand, then at her. He had the expression he sometimes got. A particular flatness that she'd learned over the months wasn't blankness, but something closer to the opposite, a controlled stillness that happened when something had surprised him and he was processing it privately. "Page 11, he said. "This equipment lease proposal. You're suggesting we don't buy the new baler. Leasing it for the first 2 years makes more financial sense given our current liquidity," she said. "Purchasing would require us to either take a loan at current interest rates, which are unfavorable, or draw down reserves I'd rather keep liquid through the rest of the restructuring period." He was quiet for a moment. "My father bought everything outright," he said. "He didn't believe in leasing." She kept her voice even. "Your father also overpaid $11,000 in freight charges for 18 months, she said. "His beliefs weren't always well examined." The silence that followed was the kind that could go several directions. She'd learned to hold still during those silences rather than filling them, which her instinct sometimes pushed her toward. Then Gideon said, "Order the lease." She nodded and turned back to her work. He stood in the doorway for another moment. She could feel it without looking, and then left. She heard his boots on the kitchen floor, the back door, and then nothing. She let out a breath she hadn't quite realized she was holding. The thing about living in close proximity with Gideon Mercer, something she hadn't fully anticipated when she'd sat across from him in Aldous' office and weighed the terms of his proposal, was that he was more complicated than his reputation suggested. Millhaven had filed him under a simple heading: cold, difficult, damaged. Those things were true enough, but they were the surface reading, and Eleanor had spent her adult life learning that surface readings were almost always incomplete. He was not cruel. That had been her primary concern, walking into this, and she'd been relieved to find it unfounded. He was demanding, of himself first, and by extension of the world around him. And he was profoundly private, and he carried whatever he carried from the past with a complete unwillingness to put it down or talk about it. But he was not cruel. He thanked the ranch hands by name and remembered details about their families. He had quietly paid the medical bill of one of his workers. She'd found the receipt in the ranch accounts, filed under miscellaneous, deliberately obscured, without saying a word to anyone about it. He fed the barn cats, even though he maintained, when she mentioned it once, that he did it to keep the rodent population down and not for any other reason. She had not pointed out that he used 4 different varieties of cat food and rotated them, which was not standard rodent management strategy. Some things, she'd learned, were better left unpointed out. May came in warm and busy. The ranch's spring operations were in full motion, calving, branding, the endless maintenance that land demanded like a toll. And Gideon was outside from before dawn until after dark most days, moving between the barns, the pastures, the fence lines with a physical endurance that Eleanor found, privately, somewhat astonishing. He was not a young man in the way young men are young. There was nothing easy about how he moved, nothing unconsidered. Every step was the product of decades of doing the same work in the same terrain. He was tired at the end of every day, in a way she could see in the set of his shoulders when he came through the door. But he came through the door every day. That counted for something. She wasn't sure exactly what, but something. They'd settled into a domestic rhythm that neither of them had planned and neither of them commented on directly. Supper at 6 or whenever he came in, whichever was later. Coffee in the morning, she made a full pot now, having noticed in February that he refilled his cup 3 times, and the single-serve habit he'd had when she arrived was purely a symptom of having no one else to make coffee for, which was a depressing thing to notice, and she'd noticed it anyway. They talked during meals, not always, but more than they had in the beginning. Practical things, mostly. Ranch business, upcoming expenses, problems with equipment or supply lines, but occasionally other things. He told her one evening in May about the time he'd lost an entire season's worth of hay to a barn fire when he was 26. Not the fire itself, he moved past that quickly, but what came after. The process of rebuilding, the specific quality of that year, the way every problem felt amplified because the margin for error had already been consumed. The way he'd learned to think 3 steps ahead of disaster, because disaster had introduced itself and he preferred to see it coming the second time. "Is that why you work the way you do?" she asked. "Like you're always bracing for the next thing." He looked at her. "Isn't that just planning?" "There's a difference between planning and bracing," she said. "One of them leaves room for things to go right." He chewed his food, looking at his plate. "Things going right doesn't need preparation," he said. "Things going wrong does." "That's true," she said. "But if all your preparation is for failure, you can miss the opportunities." A pause. "Is this your way of telling me to take more risks?" "It's my way of saying that 43% wasn't an accident. I planned for it. But I also believed it was possible, which is a different thing." She looked at him steadily. "You were surprised by the number. I wasn't." He was quiet, eating. Then, "You think I don't believe the ranch can do well?" "I think," she said carefully, "that you've spent so long keeping it from disaster that you've forgotten it's capable of more than surviving." The words landed, and she wasn't sure for a moment how they'd land. Gideon was not a man who received observation about himself gracefully. But he didn't close off, the way she'd seen him close off before. He sat with it, chewing, and when he looked up, his expression was less guarded than usual. "Maybe," he said. It was the same word he'd used in December about his father, with the same particular quality, a man making a small concession that cost him something. She didn't push it. She cleared the plates and let the conversation settle. That evening, she sat in the office until nearly midnight, working through a proposal she'd been developing for 3 weeks. A plan to expand the ranch's direct-to-consumer beef sales through a regional cooperative she'd identified, which would allow them to capture a higher margin on a portion of their output without significantly increasing operational complexity. The numbers worked. She'd checked them 4 times. She was checking them a 5th time because that was how she was built, not satisfied until she'd found the flaw, and becoming progressively more confident the longer she failed to find one. She heard him in the hallway at some point past 11. A pause outside the office door. He knocked. "Come in," she said. He opened the door and looked at the lamp and the papers and her. "It's late," he said. "I know. You're going to ruin your eyes." She looked up at him over the rim of the reading glasses she'd started wearing in February and hadn't mentioned, just begun wearing one day, hoping he wouldn't comment. He hadn't commented. "They're fine," she said. He leaned against the door frame. He had a habit of doing that, not quite entering a room, hovering at its threshold, as if he hadn't decided yet whether the space was his to occupy. "What are you working on?" he said. She told him about the cooperative proposal. She didn't walk him through the whole thing. She'd learned that Gideon absorbed information better when it was presented in summary first, detail second, rather than the reverse. He was the kind of thinker who needed the shape of an idea before he could engage with its specifics. So she gave him the shape: direct sales, higher margin, regional cooperative, 3-year pilot. He listened without interrupting. "What's the downside?" he said when she finished. She liked that he asked that. It told her something about how his mind worked, straight to the vulnerability. Not from pessimism, but from the same instinct that had built 15 years of operational caution into a reflex. "Volume commitment," she said. "We'd need to guarantee a minimum supply to the cooperative annually. If we have a bad season, drought, disease in the herd, we either default on the commitment or buy in from outside to cover it, which eats the margin. Weather insurance could cover part of that risk." "I've already factored that in," she said. "Page 4? He almost smiled. It was brief, a twitch at the corner of his mouth that arrived and departed before it fully committed, but she'd gotten better at catching them. "Send it to Aldous for a legal review," he said, "and get me a copy tomorrow." "You'll have it in the morning," she said. He straightened from the doorframe. "Eleanor." She looked up. He seemed for a moment to be searching for what he'd meant to say, or not searching exactly, but selecting. Choosing from several things and settling on the least vulnerable one, which was something she recognized in him by now. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "In a bit," she said. He left. She heard him go upstairs. She sat for a moment with her pencil in her hand, not looking at the papers, looking at the door he'd just gone through, and then she turned back to the numbers on page 4 and kept working. She wasn't sure what she was feeling exactly, or rather, she was sure, and she didn't want to be. That was a different problem, and not one she had a spreadsheet for. June arrived, and with it, 2 things that changed the temperature of the ranch's relationship with the town. The first was a profile in the Harlan County Register, a small weekly paper that Gideon had always ignored and Eleanor had always read, which ran a story about the ranch's financial turnaround. The reporter, a young woman named Cassie Farrow, who was new to the area and therefore unburdened by the town's established narratives, had called the ranch office to ask for a comment on the cattle cooperative proposal, which had apparently been discussed at a county agricultural board meeting that Eleanor hadn't known was public record. Eleanor had spoken with Cassie for 20 minutes, given her the relevant numbers, and thought nothing more about it. The article ran on a Thursday under the headline, "Mercer Ranch Leads Regional Shift in Direct Beef Sales Model." It quoted Eleanor 3 times and Gideon not at all, which was accurate since Cassie had only spoken with Eleanor, and which produced in Millhaven a reaction that Eleanor was not entirely prepared for. People called the ranch. Not just people she knew, but people from neighboring counties, other ranchers, a man from a state agricultural extension office. They wanted to speak with Mrs. Mercer, not with Gideon, with her. Gideon handed her the phone the 3rd time it rang that Thursday afternoon, said, "It's for you," with an expression she couldn't quite read, and walked back out to the barn. She took the calls. She answered the questions precisely and referred anyone with specific legal or technical needs to Aldous or to the cooperative's own representatives. She was professional about it and calm. And when the phone finally stopped ringing at around 4 in the afternoon, she sat down at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long moment. She hadn't wanted the attention. That wasn't what any of it had been for. The work had been for the ranch, for the practical, contractual requirement of keeping it viable, which was the deal she'd made and which she'd never stopped believing was simply a deal. She hadn't done it to be written about in a newspaper or to have strangers call asking for her opinion. She was still sitting at the kitchen table when Gideon came in at 6. He saw her there. He washed his hands at the sink. He opened the refrigerator, looked at its contents for a moment, then closed it. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "You cooked last night," he said. "I'll make something." She looked at him. "You cook?" "Eggs and soup. I said that when we started, but I can do more than that if pressed." "What can you do?" He thought about it. "Chili," he said. "A reasonable chili. And cornbread, if there's a mix." "There's a mix," she said. "All right then," he said, and stood up and started pulling things from the pantry. She watched him move around the kitchen, awkward in it in a specific way, the way people are awkward in spaces they haven't inhabited fully, but not unwilling, not performing either. Just doing it. He found the cast iron skillet without asking where it was, which meant he'd been paying attention to where she'd reorganized things, which meant he was paying more attention generally than he let on. "The newspaper thing," she said. "I saw it," he said, from the pantry. "I didn't know it would turn into that." "No reason you would." "I'm sorry if it was—" She stopped. She wasn't sure what word she was reaching for. He came back into the kitchen with a can of kidney beans and looked at her. "Eleanor, the ranch's revenue is up. The county paper wrote about it. People called." He set the beans on the counter. "There's nothing in that to apologize for." "I know. I just—" She pressed her lips together. "I wasn't trying to make myself the story." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. Then he said, "I know that. That's obvious." He turned back to the counter and opened the beans. "That's actually what made the story." She sat with that for a moment, not quite sure what to do with it. They ate chili at the kitchen table at 7 o'clock, and it was genuinely a reasonable chili, better than she'd expected. Not that she'd say so. Or maybe she would, because she was still deciding how much honesty the specific situation could hold. "It's good," she said. "Don't sound so surprised," he said. "I'm not surprised," she said. "I'm impressed. There's a difference." He picked up his cornbread and said nothing, but there was something in the particular way he wasn't saying it that made her think he'd registered the distinction. The second thing that June brought was a visit from Walter Briggs, a cattleman from the eastern part of the county who'd been in the business for 40 years and was regarded in the regional agricultural community as something between an institution and an oracle. He pulled up to the ranch in a truck that was older than some of the ranch buildings and got out moving slowly, bad hip, Eleanor guessed, and asked the ranch hand near the gate if Mrs. Mercer was in. Gideon was the one who came out to meet him first because Gideon was always alert to who came onto his property. He walked from the barn with that particular Gideon Mercer gait, not hurried, not aggressive, just very clearly purposeful, and met Walter Briggs at the drive. "Briggs," he said. "Gideon." Walter shook his hand. "Heard a lot about what's happening over here. Wanted to see it for myself." He paused. "And I wanted to speak with your wife." Gideon's expression was, as usual, difficult to read. He brought Walter inside. Eleanor was in the office, and she came out at the sound of voices. Gideon introduced them with less ceremony than most people would have used, which Eleanor had come to understand was actually his version of formality. Walter Briggs sat down at the kitchen table and talked with Eleanor for an hour and 20 minutes. He asked about the cooperative structure, the direct sales model, the renegotiated supplier contracts, the bidding process reform. He asked detailed, precise questions, the kind that told her he wasn't looking for a headline but was genuinely trying to understand the mechanics. She answered him fully. She showed him 2 pages of the operational plan, the ones with the structural overview. When it was over, he sat back and looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of someone recalibrating. "I'll be honest with you," he said. "I've been ranching since before you were born, and I have not seen a turnaround of this kind happen this fast without outside investment." Eleanor said, "The money was already here. It was just leaving through the wrong doors." Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. A short, genuine laugh, not the polite kind. "Well," he said, "that's one way to put it." He shook her hand when he left, and then Gideon's, and drove away in his old truck. Gideon stood in the kitchen doorway watching the truck reach the main road. "Walter Briggs hasn't asked to sit down at anyone's kitchen table in 15 years, he said. "He calls. He doesn't visit." "He had questions," Eleanor said. "He could have called." She looked at him. He was still watching the road, now empty. "Gideon," she said. "What is it?" He turned. He had the guarded look. Not the hostile guarded, but the other one. the one that meant something was closer to the surface than he intended. "Nothing," he said. She let it go. But later, washing the coffee cups from Walter's visit, she thought about his expression at the door, watching that truck drive away. It had not been the look of a man indifferent to what had just happened. It had been the look of a man who had spent a long time defined by a specific set of limits. This ranch, this reputation, this narrow corridor of what's possible, and was standing at the edge of something larger, not quite knowing whether to step forward. She thought about what she'd said to him in May, about believing in more than survival. She wondered if that was starting to land somewhere. She set the cups on the drying rack and went back to the office. The afternoon light came through the window at an angle, falling across the desk in a long stripe, and Eleanor sat down in it and pulled the cooperative proposal toward her, and found the one small error she'd been hunting for 3 weeks. A rounding discrepancy on page 7 that had been bothering her below the level of her conscious awareness like a splinter she hadn't been able to locate. She fixed it, made a note, set the corrected page aside. Outside she could hear the ranch sounds, the animals, the distant machinery, the particular percussion of a working property. Inside, the lamp, the numbers, the quiet office she'd made from a storage room. It was not the life she'd imagined at 37 in her small East Side house with her mother's medical bills and her second-hand cardigan. She wasn't sure, sitting there in the afternoon light, whether what she was feeling was contentment or something more complicated than that. Something that had crept up on her the way the ranch's problems had. Not all at once, but gradually, in the accumulation of small things. Long evenings in a lamplit room, a cup of coffee already made in the morning, the half-smile she had to be paying attention to catch. She didn't name the feeling. She was good at knowing when things didn't add up, and she was good at knowing when a number was more than it appeared on the surface. She turned back to page 8 and kept working. Summer settled over Harlan County the way it always did. Without apology, without transition, just a sudden wall of heat that arrived one morning in mid-June and made clear it intended to stay. The ranch operated differently in summer. The days started earlier and the hardest physical work got done before 10 o'clock, before the sun got high enough to make it genuinely dangerous. Afternoons were slower, maintenance and planning, and the kind of tasks that could be done in shade. Evenings stretched long and golden, and there was a quality to them that Eleanor had not expected when she'd agreed to this arrangement 9 months ago. A specific, unhurried peace that she'd never had in her East Side house, where the smallness of the space and the weight of her mother's illness had made the air feel permanently compressed. She hadn't told Gideon that. She hadn't told anyone. The cooperative agreement had been signed in late May, after Aldous reviewed it, suggested 3 minor revisions that Eleanor agreed were improvements, and declared it the most thoroughly prepared contract he'd seen come across his desk in years, which he said in a tone of mild amazement that she chose not to take personally. The first delivery under the new agreement was scheduled for August. Eleanor had already built the logistics schedule and cross-referenced it against the calving records and the projected summer weight gains with the particular obsessive thoroughness that had become, in the past months, something Gideon teased her about in the flat, understated way he teased. A single dry comment, no elaboration, delivered, and then left alone. "You've checked those numbers 4 times, he'd said one evening in May, looking over her shoulder at the cooperative schedule. 5, she said. At some point, the numbers don't change just because you look at them again. I know that, she said. I'm looking for what I missed. What if you didn't miss anything? She'd looked up at him. Then I'll find that out on the 5th check. He'd made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, moved away, poured himself coffee. But she'd noticed he hadn't actually argued with her method, which she took as a kind of endorsement. That was the shape of them now. A kind of collaborative ease that had built up over 9 months the way sediment builds layer by layer, without any single moment you could point to and say, there. That's when it changed. The office was their shared space in the evenings, or at least Gideon occupied the chair across from her desk with increasing frequency and stayed longer than necessity required. They talked about the ranch, and then about other things, and the line between those conversations had grown more permeable without either of them formally acknowledging it. She knew by now that he'd wanted to study architecture when he was 19. He'd told her that in April, sideways, the way he told her most personal things, embedded in a story about something else, offered and then quickly moved past, as if the information would be less vulnerable if it arrived incidentally. He'd said it while describing a building in Austin he'd seen once, and she'd registered the note of want in his voice and filed it quietly, and not made more of it than he seemed to want her to. He knew, because she'd told him in a moment of unguarded candor one rainy March evening, that she'd spent 2 years in her early 20s trying to get into an accounting degree program and had been denied financial aid and had gone home to care for her mother instead, and that she had never entirely resolved how she felt about that. Not bitter, exactly, but carrying a specific kind of unfulfillment the way you carry a stone in your shoe. You forget it for a while. Then it's there again. He hadn't said anything comforting about it. He'd just said, "That's a real loss," in a voice that was matter-of-fact but meant it, and somehow that had been better than comfort. These were the things that accumulated, small, specific, real. Eleanor was aware of what they amounted to. She'd been aware for some time, had identified the feeling with the same honest precision she applied to ledger discrepancies, and had reached the same conclusion she always reached when she found something in the numbers she hadn't expected. Note it. Don't act on it yet. Gather more information. The information she'd gathered over 9 months was not encouraging from a strictly self-protective standpoint. The feeling was not going away. It was, in fact, doing the opposite. She kept this entirely to herself. The terms of their arrangement had been clear. She had agreed to them with her eyes open. Gideon had not offered anything beyond what he'd stated in Aldis's office, and she had no evidence, none that she trusted anyway, that his position had changed. He was warmer with her than he'd been in the beginning, but warmth was not declaration. Comfort in each other's company was not the same thing as what she was feeling, and she knew better than to confuse the two. She had decided, simply going to manage it, the way she managed other things that were difficult and inconvenient and not likely to resolve the way she'd prefer, with patience and arithmetic and the particular discipline of a person who had learned over a long life of limited options to want what was available rather than what wasn't. She was managing it reasonably well. Until the last Saturday in June, when Vivian Hart drove into Millhaven in a silver car and parked in front of the diner, and by Monday morning the entire town knew she was back. Eleanor heard about it from the least likely source, Gideon himself, who came in from town on Monday afternoon with a set expression she hadn't seen before, not his usual controlled flatness, but something tighter, something with edges to it, and set a bag of hardware supplies on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment with his back to her. She was at the kitchen table going through invoices. She watched his back and waited. "Vivian Hart is in town," he said, not turning around. Eleanor set down her pencil. "I heard something about that this morning," she said carefully. "Linda Greer called about an unrelated matter." He turned around. He had the look of a man who has mentally rehearsed a conversation and found that the rehearsal isn't helping as much as he'd hoped. "Linda Greer doesn't call about unrelated matters." "No," Eleanor agreed. "She doesn't." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He folded his hands on the table. She noticed the gesture, the specific deliberateness of it, a man making sure his hands were somewhere visible and controlled. "I wanted you to hear it from me," he said. "I appreciate that," she said. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "It was a long time ago," he said. 19 years. "I know," she said. "I'm telling you because the town is going to—" He stopped. Revised. "People are going to say things." "People say things regularly," she said. "I've survived it before." He looked at her steadily. She looked back. She was working very hard to keep her expression at its normal register, the calm, attentive quality that she wore most of the time, and that had become, in some ways, both her greatest professional asset and her most reliable form of self-protection. Inside, something was doing something she preferred not to examine in detail. "She's widowed," he said. "Her husband died 8 months ago. She's been in Dallas. He stopped again. "You don't need to explain her circumstances to me," Eleanor said. Her voice was even. She was proud of how even it was. "I'm explaining them because they're relevant," he said. "She didn't come back here by accident." The sentence sat between them. Eleanor picked up her pencil, set it down again. "Gideon," she said, "whatever happened before, that's yours. You don't owe me a report on it." "That's not what I'm—" He pressed his mouth closed. He was frustrated, she could tell, and the frustration was not directed at her. It was the frustration of a man trying to say something he didn't have practiced language for. "I'm not reporting to you," he said finally. "I'm—" Another stop. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said, which she suspected was the most honest thing he'd managed. She looked at him for a long moment. There were several things she could have said. She chose the simplest one. "Thank you for telling me yourself," she said. He nodded once. He got up, picked up the hardware bag, and went out to the barn. She sat at the kitchen table for a while after he left, not looking at the invoices. She was not naive about what this meant. She'd known, in the abstract, about Vivian Hart for months. Millhaven's institutional memory was long and well-maintained, and the story of Gideon Mercer and Vivian Hart was one of its foundational narratives, retold with the satisfying structure of a cautionary tale. Beautiful girl, young rancher, public humiliation at the Founders' Day dance, the subsequent 19 years of Gideon's studied solitude. Eleanor had pieced it together from fragments she hadn't solicited but couldn't avoid. She understood what it had done to him. She understood, in the abstract, the particular damage of being that young and that exposed and that thoroughly rejected in front of half your community. What she had not understood, until this moment, was how she would feel about it when it became concrete. She identified the feeling with her usual diagnostic precision. It was not, she decided, jealousy in its simple form. It was something more complicated, a specific fear, the kind that arrives when you realize that something you've been careful not to want too much might now be at genuine risk of disappearing. She had managed her feelings about Gideon by keeping them hypothetical, by telling herself they were manageable, controllable, just a number to note in the ledger and account for without acting on. Vivian Hart arriving in Millhaven made them suddenly, unwillingly, extremely real. She picked up the invoices and made herself work through them. She was going to be a professional about this. She was going to honor the terms of the arrangement she'd agreed to. She was going to be, above all things, the rational, clear-eyed, competent person she'd always been. She managed that for about 4 hours. Then she put the invoices away, went to her room, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while, doing nothing productive at all. Vivian Hart came to the ranch on a Wednesday. Eleanor saw her from the office window first, the silver car turning off the main road and coming up the drive, unhurried. She watched it park. She watched the woman who got out of it and registered, with the specific misery of honesty, that the stories had not exaggerated. Vivian Hart, at what Eleanor calculated was 40, maybe 41, was still the kind of woman who made other women understand immediately and exactly what they were not. Tall, dark-haired, wearing a dress that managed to look both simple and expensive. She moved with the ease of someone who had always understood that rooms arranged themselves around her rather than the other way around. Eleanor turned away from the window before she could be seen looking. Gideon was in the barn. Eleanor heard him come out. She could tell his footsteps by now, which was a fact she didn't particularly enjoy knowing. And then voices, outside, distant enough that she couldn't make out words but close enough to track the tones. Vivian's voice had a particular quality even at a distance, warm and slightly curved, built for being listened to. Gideon's was the same as always. Flat. Careful. Eleanor went back to her work. She stayed in the office. She did not go out. This was partly dignity and partly cowardice, and she was honest enough to admit it was both. She heard the voices move toward the house, and she heard the back door open, and she heard Gideon's boots on the kitchen floor, and then a pause. Then his knock at the office door. "Come in," she said. He opened the door. He had an expression she hadn't seen before, stripped of its usual controls in a specific way, as if the effort of the last 20 minutes had used up his allocation of composure. "Vivian's here," he said. "I saw the car," she said. "She wants to stay for coffee," he said. There was something in his voice that she interpreted after a moment as a question, not a practical one. Eleanor set down her pencil and looked at him directly. "That's your decision," she said. "This is your home." Something passed across his face. "It's yours too," he said. The sentence was quiet and entirely without ceremony, and it landed somewhere in her chest with a precision that was almost physical. She looked at him for a moment, then she stood up. She walked out to the kitchen and introduced herself to Vivian Hart, with a handshake and a steady voice, and the absolute iron composure of a woman who had spent 18 years managing impossible situations and was not going to let this one be the one that broke her. Vivian was gracious. That was in some ways worse than if she'd been unpleasant. It would have been easier to dislike someone who gave her a reason. Instead, Vivian shook her hand with a warm smile and said how lovely it was to meet her and how beautiful the ranch was looking, and then sat at the kitchen table and accepted the coffee that Gideon poured with the ease of a woman returning to a place she'd never entirely left in her own mind. Eleanor sat down too. She was not going to retreat to the office. That was not who she was. Vivian talked. She had the gift of social momentum. Conversation moved forward around her without requiring much effort. She talked about Dallas, about the difficulty of the past year, about how much she'd thought about coming home. She talked about Millhaven as if it were a place she had a continuing claim on, and technically she did, but there was a quality to it that Eleanor sat with quietly and tried to characterize. It was not performance, exactly, or it was, but it was the performance of someone who had spent so long performing that they'd forgotten it was a performance. Eleanor watched Gideon while Vivian talked. He sat with his coffee cup and his controlled expression and gave the conversation less than Vivian wanted from it. One-word answers, brief nods, the minimum social maintenance. He was not rude, but he was also not warming. Vivian shifted tactics the way skilled conversationalists do, almost imperceptibly, angling toward something more personal. She mentioned the Founders' Day dance, carefully framed as a fond memory. She mentioned how young they'd all been. She did not mention the specific circumstances of that night, which Eleanor thought told her something important about what Vivian understood and chose not to say. Gideon said, "Long time ago." Vivian smiled. "Not so long," she said. "Some things don't change." Eleanor stood up and refilled the coffee cups because her hands needed something to do, and because she was aware that if she sat still another moment, she was going to do something professionally inadvisable with her facial expression. "You've done remarkable things here," Vivian said, and Eleanor realized she was being addressed directly. "I was reading about it in the Register, the cooperative, the restructuring. It's impressive." "Thank you," Eleanor said. She sat back down. "You must be a very capable woman," Vivian said. It was a compliment, clearly delivered as one. But there was a thread in it, something Eleanor couldn't quite pin, that landed slightly sideways. "I try to be useful," Eleanor said. Vivian looked at her with the specific attention of a woman taking a measurement. Then she looked at Gideon, and something shifted in her expression, something private and decided, the look of a person who has assessed a situation and arrived at a conclusion. She smiled again, and this time Eleanor identified what the thread had been. Vivian Hart did not believe the marriage was real. She had come here for whatever combination of loneliness and calculation and genuine feeling might motivate a person in her situation. And she had looked at Eleanor Mercer, plain and practical in her office cardigan, and at Gideon Mercer in his controlled, careful manner, and she had concluded that whatever was between them was arrangement, not marriage, business, not life, a temporary structure that a determined woman with the right history might walk through without much resistance. Eleanor felt something harden in her, quietly, without expression, deep in the place where she kept the things she didn't put in ledgers. Vivian left 40 minutes later. She put a hand briefly on Gideon's arm when she said goodbye, casual and practiced, and told him she hoped to see them both soon. She smiled at Eleanor with the particular warmth of someone who has decided not to consider you a threat. Gideon walked her to her car. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window. She wasn't going to pretend she didn't. And she saw them stand beside the silver car for a few minutes, talking. She couldn't see Gideon's expression from here. She watched Vivian's, open, appealing, tilted toward him in a specific way that was old muscle memory. The car left. Gideon stood at the end of the drive for a moment. Then he turned and walked back to the house. And his face, when he came through the kitchen door, was shut down in a way Eleanor hadn't seen in months. Not the careful, controlled flatness of his ordinary manner, but something rawer underneath it. The look of a man who has been somewhere painful and is not sure how to be back. She said nothing. She put a plate of food in front of him. It was past 6. She'd made supper without thinking, the way she did, and sat down across from him. He didn't touch the food immediately. "She wants to have dinner," he said. "Friday, her and me." Eleanor held very still. What did you say? I didn't say anything yet. He looked at his plate. I told her I'd think about it. She looked at him. He was looking at the table, at the food, not at her, and she could see the work happening behind his face, the old wound and the present moment and whatever he was trying to do with both of them. Gideon, she said, what do you want to do? He looked up. The expression on his face was one she hadn't seen before, uncertain, in the way a man is uncertain who has not permitted himself that feeling in a very long time. I don't know, he said. And then, after a moment, that's the problem. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 19 years of living alone, about the way he'd flinched, briefly, barely perceptibly, but she'd seen it, when Vivian touched his arm, about the barn cats and the maintenance worker's medical bill and the chair across from her desk that had become, gradually, permanently his, about the sentence he'd said an hour ago, "It's yours too," that she was still carrying in her chest like something she didn't know what to do with. She said, I think you do know. He looked at her, not the guarded look, not the controlled one, just looked at her. I think, she said carefully, that if you wanted to go, you wouldn't have come to tell me first. The silence in the kitchen was the kind that had weight to it. The evening light came through the window at a low angle, warm and fading. Outside, the ranch sounds moved through their ordinary rhythms. Animals, wind, the distant creak of the old weather vane on the barn roof. Gideon looked down at his food. He picked up his fork. He started eating, and she watched him do it, and she let the silence stay where it was, because some things needed room. After a while, he said without looking up, "The chili's better when you make it." She looked at him. "You haven't tried mine." "No," he said, "but I'll bet it is." She didn't respond to that immediately. She looked at her own plate and took a breath and decided that this particular collection of words from this particular man was a thing she was going to allow herself to feel, just for a moment, even if she had no idea what to do with it. "I'll make it next week," she said. "All right," he said. They finished supper. Eleanor cleared the plates. Gideon poured coffee without being asked and set her cup in front of her before his own, which he'd been doing for months and she'd never mentioned, and she didn't mention it now either. He didn't go to Friday dinner with Vivian Hart. He didn't call to cancel either. Eleanor knew this because Vivian called the ranch line on Thursday evening, and she happened to be the one who answered, and there was a particular pause on Vivian's end of the line when Eleanor said hello that told its own story. Eleanor told her Gideon was in the field and took a message. She wrote it on a notepad. Vivian called, Friday dinner, and left it on the kitchen counter where he'd see it. She did not editorialize. It was not her place. He saw the note. He came in at 6, read it, put it in his shirt pocket, and said nothing about it at supper. Eleanor made pot roast because she'd had the meat defrosted, and she was not going to let a personal situation disrupt her meal planning, which was perhaps a strange priority, but was genuinely where her mind was. They ate pot roast. Gideon had 2 servings, which he did silently and without ceremony. On Friday evening, at the time when dinner with Vivian would have been starting, he was sitting in the chair across from Eleanor's desk watching her reconcile the June accounts. He had a livestock journal open on his knee, but he wasn't really reading it. She could tell by the way his eyes didn't move. She didn't say anything about the irony of the timing, neither did he. But at around 8 o'clock, he set the journal down and looked at her over the lamp, and she looked back, and he said, "You were right, last Monday." She waited. "I knew," he said. "Before I told her I'd think about it, I already knew." She held his gaze. "Then why did you say you'd think about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because knowing something and being ready to know it aren't the same thing," he said. She thought about that, about the years of armor and the careful distances and the specific quality of a wound that had been so thoroughly sealed that the man carrying it had convinced himself it was structural. Not a wound at all, but just the shape of him now. "No," she said, "they're not." He looked at the desk between them, at the ledgers and the lamp and the space they'd made in this small, repurposed room out of habit and necessity, and something else that neither of them had named. "She thinks this isn't real," he said. Eleanor said nothing. "The marriage," he said. "She looked at us and decided it was—" He paused. "Convenient. For both of us. Nothing more." "I know," Eleanor said. "I saw." He looked at her directly. "She's wrong," he said. The two words were quiet and undecorated. No preamble, no qualification. Just the thing itself, said in his particular voice that gave nothing away except when it gave everything away. Eleanor looked at him. Her heart was doing something she was going to address later, privately, when she was alone and could afford to be less composed. "What does that mean?" she said, carefully. He held her gaze. He was doing the thing she'd seen him do before, measuring, selecting, choosing the least vulnerable version of the truth. She watched him decide against it. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I know it's not nothing." She sat with that. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the Texas summer dark had settled fully over the ranch, and the only sounds were the ones that had become, in 9 months, as familiar as her own breathing. "That's enough for now," she said, meaning it in every direction she could mean it. He nodded once. He picked up the livestock journal again, and this time when she looked up from the accounts 10 minutes later, his eyes were actually moving across the page. She turned back to June. The numbers for once were not what she was thinking about. Vivian Hart did not give up easily. That much became apparent over the weeks that followed, and Eleanor supposed she should have expected it. A woman who had driven back to the town she'd left, who had walked up to a man's door 19 years after the worst thing she'd done to him, who had sat at his kitchen table and smiled at his wife with that particular brand of confidence. That was not a woman who retreated at the first sign of resistance. She came back to Millhaven the following Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that. She attended the monthly agricultural board meeting, which she had no professional reason to attend, and which Gideon did because he'd been on the board for 6 years. Eleanor heard about this from Aldous, who sat on the same board and reported it with the careful neutrality of a man trying very hard not to have an opinion. She heard the rest from Patsy Mullen, who had no such restraint and delivered the information over the counter at the diner with the barely suppressed energy of someone narrating a championship bout. She sat right next to him, Patsy said, the whole 2 hours, and when it was over, she walked out with him to the parking lot. Eleanor drank her coffee. "Is that right?" she said. "Not a question." "You don't seem bothered," Patsy said, with a mixture of admiration and mild disappointment. "I'm having coffee," Eleanor said. "Bothered doesn't help the coffee." Patsy refilled her cup and watched her with the particular expression of a woman recalibrating her assessment. What Patsy could not see, and what Eleanor had become skilled at not showing, was the specific quality of the effort that composure required. She was not unaffected. She was managing, which was different and which cost something. She sat through those weeks the way she'd sat through difficult financial quarters, with patience and clear eyes and the belief, not always easy to sustain, that having accurate information was more useful than having comfortable assumptions. The accurate information, as best she could gather it, was this. Gideon had not gone to dinner with Vivian, had not called her, had not, as far as Eleanor could tell, sought her out in any way. But he had not told her to stop either. He moved through the Vivian situation the way he moved through most difficult things, in silence, processing privately, giving the world a surface that revealed nothing. Eleanor trusted him. She had established this fact sometime around March, without ceremony or announcement, the way you establish most important things, gradually, through accumulated evidence rather than a single moment of decision. She trusted him. But trust and peace were not the same thing, and she was not at peace, and she was honest enough with herself to know why. Gideon, for his part, was not behaving like a man being tempted. He was behaving like a man being watched by someone he wasn't sure how to talk to. He came home every evening. He sat in the office chair. He ate supper across from her and talked about the ranch and sometimes other things. But there was a quality to the weeks of July, a tension underneath the ordinary rhythms that neither of them was addressing, and Eleanor felt it the way you feel a change in barometric pressure before a storm arrives. Everything looked the same. The air was different. The storm arrived on a Saturday evening in late July. Gideon had gone into town in the afternoon, hardware, he said, and feed, and came back later than expected. Eleanor was in the kitchen when she heard his truck in the drive, and she heard the door, and she heard him come down the hall with a step that was different from his usual one, the way a person's walk changes when something has happened. He came into the kitchen. He looked, she searched for the right word, and landed on unsettled, which was the word she'd used for a number that had come out wrong on both columns. Not broken, not angry, unsettled. "Sit down," she said because he was just standing there. He sat. She put coffee in front of him. He looked at it. "She was at the hardware store," he said. Eleanor sat across from him. "Vivian. Coincidence, maybe." He said it in a tone that didn't fully believe the word. "We talked for a while. In the parking lot." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "She said a lot of things." Eleanor waited. "She said she made a mistake," he said. 19 years ago. She said she was young and scared and made the wrong choice, and she spent a long time knowing it." He paused. "She said she came back because she heard I'd done well. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Said she thought we could start over, if I was willing." The kitchen was quiet. Eleanor kept her face at its normal register, which was the hardest thing she'd done in months. "What did you say?" she said. He looked up at her. "I told her I'd think about it." He saw her expression shift, almost imperceptibly, but he was watching closely. I didn't mean it the way it came out. It's what I say when I don't know what to say, and I need time." "I know," she said, because she did. He set down the coffee cup. He looked at the table between them. "The thing is," he said, "I kept waiting while she was talking to feel something that would tell me what to do. And what I felt," he stopped, his jaw worked, "was that I wanted to come home." Eleanor looked at him. "Not away from her," he said. "Not just that. I wanted to be here specifically, in this house." He glanced up at her. "I kept thinking about supper, which is a strange thing to think about in a parking lot." "What about supper?" she said carefully. "About coming in and it being ready," he said, "or not ready, and sitting in the office while you finish working and it not mattering that it wasn't ready yet." He was speaking with the particular difficulty of a man translating from a language he doesn't know he speaks. "I've been doing that for months, noticing it, not—" He stopped again. "Not what?" she said. "Not letting myself know what it meant," he said. The evening light in the kitchen was the low gold of late July, the kind that made everything look like a photograph of itself. Eleanor sat in it and looked at the man across from her. The difficult, careful, not unkind man who kept cat food in 4 varieties and filed charity under miscellaneous and had once described her mother's lost potential as a real loss without any decoration. And she thought about what she'd promised herself back in June, that she was going to manage it, be professional about it, want what was available. "Gideon," she said. He looked at her. "I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." A pause. He nodded. She folded her hands on the table. "When we made this arrangement, I agreed to the terms with full understanding of what they were. I haven't changed that agreement, and I'm not trying to renegotiate it now." She met his eyes. "But I would be dishonest, which I don't think either of us can afford, if I pretended that the past year has been what I expected it to be. When I signed that contract, I expected a practical situation, a transaction." She paused. "It stopped being only that somewhere around February, for me. I'm telling you that so you have complete information, not because I'm asking for anything." The kitchen was very quiet. "February," he said. "The fence replacement analysis," she said. "You came into the office and you said that's a real loss about my mother and the accounting program. And then you left, and I sat there, and I thought, this is a problem." A brief, rueful, almost smile. "I'm good at identifying problems, less good at solving them when the solution isn't available." He looked at her for a long moment. Something was moving behind his face, the particular movement of a man working something loose that has been fastened down a long time. "Eleanor," he said, "what if the solution is available?" She went still. "What if," he said slowly, finding the words as he went, "I have been living in this house for 9 months and watching you work and watching you handle everything that came at this ranch, and watching you sit across from Vivian Hart with perfect composure when I could barely manage it myself. And what if somewhere in all of that I have felt things I have spent considerable effort not examining?" She looked at him. "Why?" she said carefully. "Why not examine them?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because the last time I let myself feel something like that," he said, "I was 20 years old in front of half this county, and I swore I would never put myself in that position again. I know, she said. And then I married you, he said, which was supposed to be safe, because it was a transaction, because you were... He stopped, started again. Because you were the kind of woman who would keep the terms. I have kept the terms, she said. I know, he said. But the terms stopped being enough. He looked at his hands. Somewhere around February, if I'm matching up the timeline. The silence between them was different from other silences. It had weight and warmth both, the specific quality of two people standing at the edge of something and both knowing it. Eleanor said, "You are a very difficult man to live with." He looked up. I know. You're stubborn and private, and you don't talk about things until you've thought about them for months past when a normal person would have said something. Also correct. And you feed those cats with 4 kinds of food, which is genuinely absurd. Something happened to his face. Not quite a smile, see, more than a twitch, less than the full thing, landing somewhere in the middle. They have preferences, he said. Gideon. Eleanor. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the July light. This man who was not easy and not simple and not anything she'd planned for. And she made the decision that she'd been working up to for months without admitting she was working up to it. Come here, she said. He looked at her. He was still for a moment, the particular stillness of a man deciding whether the ground is solid enough to step on. Then he stood up. He walked around the table. He stood in front of her, and she stood up too, and they were closer than they'd been in the 9 months they'd shared this house. And she could see every line in his face and the gray at his temples and the small scar at his chin she'd never asked about. He put his hand against her face, not confident about it, tentative, like something he hadn't done in a very long time and wasn't sure he remembered how. His palm was rough from work and warm from the coffee cup. I'm not good at this, he said. I know, she said. I might be bad at it for a while. I've read your accounting records for 18 months, she said. I have a realistic picture of your deficits. He made a sound, short, startled, genuine, the closest thing she'd ever heard from him to an actual laugh. It surprised them both. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the 19 years of armor and the practical contract and the business arrangement all sat somewhere outside the kitchen in the Texas summer air, while the two of them stood in the July light, which was still beautiful even though neither of them was the kind of person who usually noticed beauty as a thing worth stopping for. He kissed her. It was not the practiced kiss of a man who'd been doing this all along. It was careful and real and slightly uncertain, the way he was about everything that mattered to him, and Eleanor put her hand against his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was faster than his expression let on, and thought, with the last analytical corner of her brain before it gave up and let her feel things without categorizing them, that this was the truest piece of information she'd gathered in a year of looking. When they stepped back, his hand was still at her face. He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at the ranch accounts, carefully, completely, like he was making sure the number he was seeing was the real one. I should have, he started. Don't, she said. Don't apologize for the timeline. We got here. He nodded. He let out a breath that had, she thought, been held a very long time. The following morning, Gideon Mercer drove into Millhaven alone and found Vivian Hart at the diner where she had apparently made a habit of taking her morning coffee. He stood in the doorway long enough that she noticed him and smiled and began to reach for her bag to make room at the table. He walked over. He did not sit down. He stood at the edge of her table and looked at her, and she looked back, and the diner was doing its ordinary Saturday morning business around them. Patsy at the counter, a table of older men near the window, the smell of biscuits and coffee. I wanted to come and tell you myself, he said, instead of just not calling. Vivian's smile had changed quality. Tell me what, she said, though her voice indicated she already had a reasonable guess. You're too late, he said. Simply, directly, in the particular Gideon Mercer way that did not apologize for its own bluntness. Not because I'm angry at you, not because of what happened 19 years ago exactly, just too late. That's the fact of it. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face that was real. He could tell, because Vivian had always been easiest to read when she was genuinely affected. Some of what was in her expression was pain, and he was not unmoved by that. He was not trying to be cruel. You love her, Vivian said. Not a question. He held her gaze. I do, he said, and he hadn't said it out loud before, much, not to Eleanor, not to anyone. And the words landed in his own chest with a force that surprised him. Not the force of pain the way love had felt at 20. Something else. Something steadier. Vivian pressed her lips together. She looked down at her coffee cup. She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment he saw, genuinely saw, maybe for the first time, what the years had actually done to her. Not the beauty, which was still there, but the cost underneath it, the loneliness she'd been carrying. He understood loneliness. He'd been its close neighbor for 19 years. I hope she knows it, Vivian said quietly. She's going to, he said. He meant it, and he knew, standing in Patsy Mullen's diner on a Saturday morning with half the town pretending not to watch, that meaning it and saying it were two different requirements, and he'd only completed one of them. He drove back to the ranch. Eleanor was in the garden. She'd started one in April, a small practical thing at the side of the house, mostly herbs and some tomatoes. Nothing decorative, and he'd never commented on it, but he'd noticed it the way he noticed everything she did, the slow and thorough way. She was crouched over the tomato plants with a look of focused attention, a smear of dirt on her forearm. She heard his truck. She looked up. He got out and walked toward her, and she straightened, and she looked at him with the direct, steady look she had. The one that never asked for more than he was ready to give, that had given him room to get here at his own pace, which was slower than most, and which she had never once made him feel badly about. He stopped in front of her. I told her, he said. Eleanor looked at him. How is she? It was such a specifically Eleanor question. Not what did you say, not what happened, but that he felt the thing in his chest again, the thing that was steadier than what he'd felt at 20. She'll be all right, he said. I think she'll be all right. Eleanor nodded. She looked down at the tomato plant she'd been tending, then back at him. Good, she said, and meant it in the way she meant things, plainly, without agenda. He looked at her standing in the July sun with dirt on her arm and her hair escaping its tie in the heat, and he thought about the legal document in Aldous' filing cabinet that had started all of this, and the small navy dress from the consignment shop, and 8 minutes with Harold Kimball and his pipe tobacco smell, and the lamp in the office and the chair across the desk, and the February evening when she'd looked at him and said, That's a real loss, as if his losses were the kind worth naming. I need to say something, he said. She looked at him. All right. He'd been thinking about how to say it since he left the diner. He'd gone through several versions in the truck, rejected them all for being either too little or too much. He was not a man with easy access to his own interior, and he knew it, and he knew she knew it, and that was perhaps the best starting point he had. When my father left that condition in the will, he said, I thought he was punishing me. One last act of control from a man who never knew how to let go. He paused. I spent the first few months thinking he'd cornered me, made me do something I never intended. Eleanor was quiet, watching him. But I've been thinking lately, he said, about what you said in December, about people saying things sideways, indirectly. He looked at her. Maybe he saw something I couldn't see about myself, that I was going to live out here alone until I died and call it a choice and never know what I'd traded away. Her expression was careful. What did you trade away? Before you came, he said. This ranch was what I had. I knew that, and I was fine with it. I'd made peace with it. He met her eyes. I don't know when it changed. I know it did. I know that this house, with you in it, is not the same place it was. And I know that what I want now is something I didn't know I was capable of wanting anymore. She was very still. I love you, he said. He said it the way he said the truest things, without softening it, without surrounding it with enough other words to make it seem less exposed. Just the thing itself. That's what I needed to say. Eleanor stood in the July sun and looked at him for a long moment. He saw something happen in her face, not surprise exactly, because Eleanor almost never looked surprised, but something that was the emotional equivalent of a number you'd suspected was there finally appearing on the ledger, confirmed and real. Her eyes were bright. She blinked once. I know, she said. I mean, I hoped. I thought, possibly. She paused. I have been thinking about this since February, and I have turned it over more times than the cooperative numbers, which is saying something. He looked at her. And I love you too, she said. Obviously. I've been managing that particular fact for 6 months with very limited success. He was quiet for a moment. You could have told me, he said. You weren't ready, she said. He thought about that. He thought about the distance he'd needed, and the time, and the particular circuitous route he'd taken to get to a parking lot in July where he'd wanted to come home to supper. No, he said. I wasn't. I know your pace, she said. I wasn't going to push you past it. He reached out and took her hand. Her hands were always either ink-stained or work-roughened, practical hands, hands that had spent years doing what needed doing without anyone noticing. He held it, a little awkwardly, the way he'd been awkward last night. Not from lack of feeling, but from insufficient practice. She did not make it easier for him by filling the space. She just let him hold her hand in the July morning and waited, patient in the specific Eleanor way that had nothing passive in it. Active patience, chosen deliberately. I don't know how to do this well, he said. I want to be honest about that. You're already doing it better than you think, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. The chili, he said. She blinked. What? You said you'd make chili next week, a few weeks ago. He looked faintly embarrassed, a look she'd never seen on him before, and that did something specific to her chest. You never did. She stared at him for a moment. Then she said, You have been waiting for the chili. I wasn't waiting, I just remembered. Gideon Mercer, she said, and something in her voice had shifted, a warmth that had been underneath the professional surface all along now simply present, unmanaged, unhidden. I will make you chili this week. You don't have to make it a thing, he said. It's already a thing, she said. You brought up the chili. He looked at her. The almost smile arrived, and this time it went all the way. Actually became a smile, real and slightly crooked and completely unguarded, the first one she'd seen that wasn't self-interrupted. It changed his face entirely. It made him look younger and less armored, and like someone she was going to spend a very long time learning. All right, he said. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The August delivery to the cooperative came in 10 days later, and it went without a single logistical problem, which Eleanor had ensured by checking the schedule 5 times. A fact she mentioned to Gideon, who said, Of course you did, in the tone that was no longer dry distance, but something warmer, something that knew her. The ranch hands noticed something had shifted between the boss and his wife. It was the kind of thing you couldn't easily articulate but couldn't miss. The specific change in the air around 2 people who have stopped maintaining a careful distance. Denny Rourke, who'd worked at Mercer Ranch for 11 years, mentioned it to the other hand, a young man named Cal, who said he'd noticed it weeks ago, and they both agreed without further discussion to behave as if they hadn't noticed anything. The town's awareness took slightly longer, as collective awareness does, and arrived not as a single revelation, but as a gradual shift in the dominant narrative. The story that had been told about the Mercer marriage, transactional, doomed, strange, began developing inconsistencies that were hard to ignore. The way Gideon held the door at the feed store. The way Eleanor smiled at something he said at the county board meeting that Patsy Mullen had not been at personally, but heard about through 3 reliable sources. Small things. The currency of a small town. What the town was working toward, slowly and in its own time, was a revision. A new story to replace the comfortable old one. Eleanor, for her part, was not thinking about what the town was working toward. She was sitting in her office, their office now, in a real sense, on an evening in late August, and Gideon was in the chair across from her reading, and the lamp was on, and the window was open to the warm night air, and she was reconciling the July accounts while he occasionally said something about whatever he was reading that she responded to without looking up from her ledger, and then went back to her column. It was ordinary. It was completely ordinary. She was, she realized, doing the things she'd told herself not to do back in the controlled days of early spring. She was cataloging. Not the discrepancies and the losses, but the other kind. The lamp, the chair, his voice in the quiet room, the ranch sounds outside the open window. She was adding them up. The total, she thought, was not something she could put in a ledger. It exceeded the available columns. She was going to need a different system. You're smiling at the accounts, Gideon said without looking up from his book. I'm not. You are. You have the look you get when a number comes out right. She looked up at him. He was looking at his book but not reading it. It does, she said. Come out right. He looked up then. The lamp caught his face in that particular way it had, half lit, familiar, the face of a man she knew by now with the specific intimacy of someone who'd watched him in every ordinary condition of a shared life. He looked at her with the directness he brought to things that were real to him. Yeah, he said, it does. She went back to the accounts. He went back to his book. The August night moved through its hours around them, warm and unhurried, while inside the lamp burned and the numbers added up and the ordinary, extraordinary business of two people building a life went on without fanfare, the way the most durable things are built, quietly and piece by piece and over time. The legal deadline arrived on a Thursday, not with any drama. That was the thing about deadlines that actually mattered. Gideon had learned over a life of them. The ones that could break you didn't announce themselves with weather or ceremony. They arrived like any other Thursday. The alarm at 4:30, the dark outside the window, the smell of coffee already made because Eleanor was always up before him now, and neither of them had commented on when that started. Just one morning it was true, and then it kept being true. He came downstairs and she was at the kitchen table with her coffee and a document he recognized, the copy of the will condition that Aldous had given him 13 months ago, worn at the fold lines from being opened and closed. She looked up when he came in. Today, she said. I know, he said. He poured his coffee and sat across from her. The document sat between them on the table. Outside, the ranch was doing what it always did in the early dark. The animals shifting, the particular pre-dawn quiet that wasn't really quiet at all, but its own kind of full. Aldous calls at 9, she said. He files the confirmation with the court this morning. Randall's attorneys have until noon to contest. They won't contest, Gideon said. There's nothing to contest. No, she said. There isn't. He looked at the document. He thought about the Tuesday in October when he'd sat across from Aldous and heard those words for the first time, marry within 1 year, and the specific quality of the cold rage he'd felt, the trapped feeling, the absolute certainty that this was his father's last act of interference in a life that had never entirely been his own. He thought about what Eleanor had said in December, about people saying things sideways. He was not ready to be grateful to Hector Mercer. He wasn't sure he'd ever get all the way there, but he could sit with the possibility that the old man had known something, had seen, with the particular clarity that sometimes comes to difficult people in their final years, that his son was building a very clean and very empty life, and calling it enough. Hey, Eleanor said. He looked up. It's going to be a regular Thursday, she said, after 9 o'clock. I know. We should probably fix the water line on the east pasture today. Cal flagged it yesterday. He looked at her, at the practical, steady, ink-stained, entirely real woman across from him, who had turned his failing ranch around and dismantled his solitude, so gradually he hadn't felt it happening until he was already on the other side of it. You want to talk about the water line, he said. I want you to not sit here dreading a phone call that's going to go fine, she said. The water line is a better use of the next 4 hours. He almost smiled. He was getting better at letting them finish. All right, he said. He fixed the water line. Aldous called at 9:07. The filing was confirmed. Randall's attorneys, who had apparently known since August, based on a tip from someone in the county court office that Eleanor had quietly cultivated as a contact, did not contest. By 10:15, the matter was legally resolved. Mercer Ranch belonged to Gideon Mercer without condition, encumbrance, or the shadow of a deadline over it for the first time in 13 months. Gideon was in the barn when Eleanor came to tell him. She walked in with her phone in her hand and said, Aldous, it's done. He set down the piece of equipment he'd been repairing. He stood for a moment. Okay, he said. She looked at him. That's all? What do you want me to say? I don't know. Something. He looked around the barn, the familiar dark and smell of it, the horses shifting in their stalls, the light coming through the high windows at that particular morning angle he'd been seeing his whole life. 6,000 acres. 6 generations of people who had pulled something living from this ground and passed it forward. His, now, without anyone's permission required. "Thank you," he said. He was looking at the barn, but he meant her, and she knew it. "You're welcome," she said, simply, and turned to go back to the office. "Eleanor." She stopped. "Take the afternoon," he said. "The accounts will be there tomorrow." She looked back at him. "What would I do with an afternoon?" "Whatever you want," he said. "You're allowed to want things that aren't ranch business." She considered this with the expression she used for proposals that required evaluation. "I'd like to drive out to the Miller's Creek overlook," she said finally. "I've been meaning to go since spring." "Then go," he said. "You could come," she said. And then, with the characteristic honesty that still occasionally caught him off guard after all these months, "I'd like it if you came." He looked at the equipment he'd been repairing, at the schedule for the day in his head, the list of tasks that had been accumulating. He thought about what Eleanor had said to him back in May, that he'd spent so long bracing for disaster that he'd forgotten the ranch was capable of more than surviving. He thought about how that had been true of more than the ranch. "Give me an hour," he said. They drove out to Miller's Creek after lunch. It was a September afternoon, the heat finally beginning to moderate, the sky a hard, clean blue. The overlook sat at the edge of the property's northeast corner, a limestone shelf above the creek that looked out over a long sweep of Mercer land, brown and gold in the early fall, stretching to the tree line. Eleanor had brought a blanket and 2 cups of coffee in a thermos, because she was constitutionally incapable of not being practical about things, which was a quality he had stopped finding ironic and started finding genuinely comforting. They sat on the limestone shelf and drank their coffee and looked at the land. "Your father chose well," Eleanor said after a while. "When he bought the northeast parcel, this piece." "He bought it in 1974, Gideon said, paid less than it was worth because the seller didn't know about the water rights." "He was sharp." "He was ruthless," Gideon said. "There's overlap, but they're not the same thing." She considered that. He was also right about some things. Gideon looked at her sidelong. "Don't be generous about it." "I'm not being generous. I'm being accurate." She had her knees pulled up, the coffee cup balanced on one knee, looking out at the land. "He knew you wouldn't do this on your own. He knew you'd get here eventually, but only if someone put a deadline on it." She paused. "He was probably wrong about a lot, but that part he got right." Gideon was quiet for a while. The creek moved below them, catching light. A hawk turned slow circles over the southern pasture, patient and unhurried. "I've been thinking about the north field," he said, "the one we left fallow this year. I want to put it under the cooperative agreement next cycle, expand the direct beef operation." He glanced at her. "Your numbers support it." "They do," she said. "I was going to bring it up next week. You were waiting for me to get there first," he said. She didn't deny it. "You engage better with ideas that feel like yours." He turned to look at her fully. She was watching the hawk, her profile quiet and familiar. "That should probably bother me," he said. "Probably," she agreed. "It doesn't." "I know," she said, and there was something in her voice that was warm without performing warmth, the way she was warm, genuinely, without announcement. He reached over and took her hand, the way he'd been doing since July, with a little less awkwardness each time, though there was still some awkwardness, and he suspected there always would be. He was not a man who would ever make physical affection look easy. She had told him once, in August, that she didn't need easy. He had held that statement for weeks, turning it over, and had eventually decided it was the most important thing anyone had said to him in years. They sat on the limestone shelf until the afternoon light started to lean, and then they drove home. The fall moved through its rhythms with a different quality than the previous fall. Gideon noticed this without being entirely sure how to articulate it. Less bracing, more expansive. The ranch's operation had reached a stability that was not the anxious, patched-together stability of an enterprise barely holding on, but something with actual margin to it. Room to think ahead instead of just managing what was behind. Eleanor presented the Northfield proposal formally in October, 14 pages as usual, projections through a 3-year expansion window. He read all of it, he approved it. He suggested one modification, a phasing adjustment that she agreed was an improvement and incorporated without making a point of it. They were getting good at that, the specific collaboration of 2 people with genuinely different ways of thinking who had learned to use the difference rather than work around it. The town of Millhaven completed its revision of the Mercer story sometime around November. There was no single moment you could point to. It accumulated, the way collective opinions do, out of enough small observations building in the same direction. What emerged was something they were not entirely comfortable with and would not have asked for, a kind of civic pride. The county paper ran a follow-up to Cassie Farrow's original piece, this one with a photograph that neither of them had been warned about. Gideon at the fence line, Eleanor beside him with a ledger under her arm, both of them looking at something outside the frame of the picture. It ran above the fold. Patsy Mullen laminated a copy and put it on the wall of the diner. Eleanor saw it on a Tuesday morning and stood in front of it for a long moment. "You knew about this," she said to Patsy. "Cassie called me," Patsy said without apology. "I might have encouraged her." Eleanor looked at the photograph. The two of them, side by side, not posing. "We look like we're arguing about something," she said. "You probably were," Patsy said. Eleanor looked at her, then at the photograph. Then she left without saying anything else, which Patsy interpreted correctly as a form of acceptance. Walter Briggs called in November to invite them both to speak at a regional agricultural conference in the spring. Not Gideon alone, not Eleanor alone, both of them. "What you've built out there," he said over the phone, "is something people need to hear about. Not just the financial part. The whole thing." He paused. "How two people running the same operation in two different directions can make it go further than either of them could alone." Gideon told him he'd think about it, which Eleanor now understood meant yes, and she confirmed it directly before he could second-guess himself. "We'll be there," she told Walter. Gideon, standing nearby, looked at her. She looked back, unrepentant. "You're going to do that forever, aren't you?" he said. "Confirm things before I talk myself out of them." "Probably," she said. He shook his head, but it was the head shake she'd come to read correctly. The one that wasn't disapproval, but was its own kind of affection, the dialect of a man who expressed things at an angle. Christmas came for the second time. Eleanor put up the wreath again, and this year added a second one for the barn door, which Gideon noted without comment, and which was there the following morning, so she took it as approval. She made the same real supper as the year before, roast, bread, pie. But this year he was in the kitchen with her for part of it, doing the parts she assigned him with the focused application of someone who takes even secondary tasks seriously. He was better with the cornbread than she'd given him credit for. She told him so. "Don't act surprised," he said. "I'm not surprised," she said. "I'm updating my information." He looked at her sideways. "That's the most you thing you've ever said." "Thank you," she said, and meant it genuinely, which made him stop and look at her for a moment before going back to the cornbread. After supper, with the candles low the way they'd been a year ago, she put something on the table between them, a small envelope. He looked at it. "What's this?" "Open it," she said. He opened it. Inside was a single printed page, a course registration confirmation from the State Agricultural College. A 2-semester program in advanced financial management for agricultural operations. Starting in January, offered remotely with 1 monthly in-person session. He looked at it for a moment, then at her. "This is a real program," he said. "It counts toward a certificate," she said. "It's not the accounting degree you would have gotten at 20, but it counts." He looked at the paper. She watched his face and saw the thing she'd been seeing more often lately. The thing that happened when he let something reach him without first processing it into a more manageable form. She'd never told him she could see it, because he didn't need to know how readable he was to her. That was information she kept in her own private ledger. "Eleanor," he said. "You don't have to do it," she said. I just found it. Thought you should know it existed." He set the paper down. He looked at the table, the candles, the remains of the supper. Then he folded the paper carefully and put it back in the envelope. "I'll call the admissions office Monday," he said. She nodded. She picked up her coffee cup. "Thank you," he said. The way he'd said it in the barn in October. Not the ordinary courtesy version, but the weighted one. The one that meant something. "You would have found it yourself eventually," she said. "No, I wouldn't," he said, plainly. "You know I wouldn't." She looked at him. "No," she said. "Probably not." They sat with the candles until late, talking about the Northfield expansion and the conference in the spring and what Cal had done to the Westgate hinge that was going to require a professional repair, and then about other things. The book she was reading, a memory he had from a winter when he was 9 that he'd never told anyone, the specific shade of the creek in October that they'd both noticed separately from the overlook and compared notes on now. Small things, the substance of a life that had been built from the inside out, without a blueprint, by two people who had been given each other by necessity and had chosen each other by something else entirely. Years later, and there would be years, that was the thing that neither of them took for granted, because neither of them was built for taking things for granted. The question came up at the regional conference, not from Walter Briggs, but from a young rancher in the third row who asked it simply and directly the way young people sometimes do when they haven't yet learned to dress their real questions in more acceptable clothes. He looked at Gideon and said, "How did you know she was the right person, when it started as something else entirely? How did you know?" The room was quiet. Eleanor was sitting beside him at the conference table, her pen in her hand, a notepad with her usual precise marginalia visible to anyone close enough. She didn't look at him. She was looking at the notepad, but her pen had stopped. Gideon looked at the young man. He thought about the question, not because he didn't know the answer, but because the answer was something he'd arrived at over a long time through a route he wouldn't wish on anyone and wouldn't trade for anything, and that contradiction was the core of it. "The world spends a lot of time telling you what to look for," he said, "what a person should look like, how they should make you feel in the first 5 minutes." He paused. "It doesn't spend much time on character, on what a person does when there's nothing in it for them. When the situation is hard and they stay anyway, not because they have to, but because leaving isn't who they are." The young man nodded slowly. "I thought I was marrying her to save a ranch," Gideon said. He did not look at Eleanor while he said it. He would later, when this was done. "I was wrong about that. Or, I was right. And also completely missing the point. The ranch got saved, but that's not the thing that mattered." He paused. The room was very still. "She saved something harder to fix than a ranch," he said. "And she did it so quietly I almost didn't notice. That's character. That's what you look for, if you're paying attention." He looked down at the table for a moment. "I almost wasn't." Afterward, driving back from the conference on a late afternoon in March, with the hill country moving past the windows, and Eleanor in the passenger seat with her notebook, he said, "You could have answered that." She looked up from her notes. "You were doing fine. I wasn't expecting it." "I know. You were better for it." She turned back to the notebook. Prepared answers sound like prepared answers. He drove for a while in the comfortable silence that was one of the better things about being known by someone. The ability to be quiet without it meaning anything was wrong. Then she said, without looking up from the notebook, "You almost weren't, though." "Almost wasn't what?" "Paying attention," she said. He looked at the road. "I got there," he said. "You did," she said. "Eventually. You could be more generous about the timeline." She looked up at him and there was something in her face, the private, unmanaged warmth she didn't put on public display, but that he had come to think of as his, in the way that the chair across her desk was his and the early morning coffee was his, and the specific weight of her attention when she turned it fully in his direction was his. "I could be," she said, "but then you'd never know what it cost you." He looked at the road. "Fair," he said. She went back to her notebook. He drove. The hill country rolled past in the March light, warm and brown, and just beginning, to show the first pale green of what was coming. The ranch was waiting when they got home, all 6,000 acres of it, the animals and the fences and the limestone soil and the creek catching last light in the northeast corner. It was not a perfect place. It had failing equipment and seasonal drought and a barn roof that needed attention and a gate hinge that Cal had mangled and not fixed. It had the usual inventory of problems that any living thing accumulates over time. But the ledgers were clean. The cooperative was in its second successful year. The Northfield expansion was underway. The certificate program had produced in Gideon a specific and quietly visible satisfaction that Eleanor noted in her private accounting and did not mention to his face, because some things were better kept in the margins. They pulled into the drive and got out and stood for a moment in the evening air, the way they sometimes did, without a reason that needed stating. "The tomatoes need to go in soon," Eleanor said, looking at the garden. Couple more weeks, he said. Last year I planted too late. I know. I watched you replant them. She looked at him. You never said anything. You figured it out, he said. You didn't need me to say anything. She looked at the garden, then at him, then at the house with its lights coming on in the early dark, the way lights do when a house is lived in by people who are home. I'm going to start dinner, she said. I'll be in, he said. 20 minutes. She walked toward the house. He stood in the drive a little longer the way he did sometimes, not brooding, just present. Looking at the land in the fading light, feeling the specific weight of a day that had been real, in the way days are real when you're inside your own life rather than waiting for it to begin. He was not a man who had gotten everything right. He'd been wrong about the value of solitude, and wrong about his ability to stop feeling things, and wrong about what the ranch needed and what he needed and what it meant to need things at all. He'd been slower than he should have been, and more afraid than he'd ever admitted, and he'd almost let all of it calcify into a life that was functional and empty and called itself fine. He thought about his father. He thought about a condition written into a will by a man who could never say what he meant directly. He thought, and this was the thought he'd been working toward for 13 months without knowing it, that maybe the most important things don't arrive the way you expect them to. They arrive through the side door while you're busy arguing about terms and looking the other way. They arrive in navy dresses from consignment shops, in ledgers opened at 11 o'clock at night, in practical questions asked with extraordinary patience by a woman who never asked for more than you were ready to give. He'd been given something he hadn't known how to want. He'd learned slowly, with all the difficulty that slowness carries, how to want it. That was the story. Not the version the town told, the polished revision they'd worked out over 2 years, the example of true partnership and the smartest woman in the valley, and the rancher who finally came around. That version was true enough, but it left out the specific texture of the real thing, the bad couch and the cold coffee and the 5-time number checks and the barn cats with their rotating menu and the conversations that went wrong before they went right, and the 19 months it took 2 people to cover the distance between an arrangement and a life. He turned and walked toward the house. Through the kitchen window he could see Eleanor at the counter, moving with the particular efficiency she brought to everything, and the light was warm and the evening was coming down over the ranch the way evening always did, without ceremony or hurry, the same as it always had been, and now somehow entirely different. He went inside. The door closed behind him. The ranch was quiet and full and home.